In the early hours of March 1st, 1954, the Marshallese people on Bikini Atoll were waking up to another ordinary morning. Fishermen were preparing their boats. Children were still asleep in their huts. The sea was calm. The sky was clear. And then, everything changed. They called this event Castle Bravo, the largest nuclear weapon the United States had ever detonated. Blinding, screaming energy, 1,000 times more powerful than Hiroshima. But that wasn't the plan. Scientists had expected much less. What they got was a firestorm so violent it left a massive crater, boiled the sea, and painted the atmosphere with radioactive dust, and worse. The fallout didn't stay in the blast zone. What came next? No one could have imagined. Nearby islands were drenched in invisible poison. Children played in what looked like snow, not realizing it was radioactive ash. A Japanese fishing boat, the Lucky Dragon, was hit 80 miles away. One crewman died. But back in the Pacific, the Marshallese people were left to fend for themselves. Their land was poisoned, their culture uprooted, generations born into exile, into sickness and into silence, and yet their story rarely makes the history books. So, what really happened here? Why was this paradise turned into a radioactive graveyard? Why were generations of islanders displaced, scattered across oceans, still waiting for answers? But the biggest mystery, what actually happened to the indigenous people of Bikini and the generations that followed? Radiation doesn't just leave scars, it leaves a legacy. And decades later, their story is far from over. To understand how it all began, you have to go back to the end of World War II. The world had just seen the giant mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the US had become the top nuclear power. But that didn't last. The Soviet Union made its own bomb by 1949, and what came next was a scary, fast race into danger, the Cold War arms race. Now, just having a bomb wasn't enough. It had to be bigger, faster, and even more deadly, ready to destroy cities in an instant. So the US took a huge part of the Pacific Ocean and named it the Pacific Proving Grounds, a cold name for a place that would soon face massive destruction. From 1946 to 1958, the US set off 67 nuclear bombs in the Marshall Islands, 23 of them on Bikini Atoll. The rest? At a nearby place called NUKED. That's more nuclear power than all the bombs used in World War II. The first tests were part of something called Operation Crossroads in 1946. Atomic bombs that were simple compared to today's, but still extremely deadly. They tested how warships would handle the blast. They tested what would happen to animals. They kept testing until almost everything was destroyed. Then in 1952 came Ivy Mike, the world's first real hydrogen bomb. A huge and powerful weapon, but it was just a test model, too big to use in war and built like a giant building. So scientists worked hard to make a smaller version that could fit on a bomber plane. By 1954, they did it. They made a 23,500-pound bomb called Shrimp. But this was no normal test. This was Operation Castle, a series of 6 huge explosions, each one pushing the limits of science. All meant to build H-bombs that could be used in real war. The first one, Castle Bravo, the one they said was under control, the one they said would be safe. But it wasn't safe at all. Even before Bravo exploded, the people of Bikini had already been moved. Not because it was dangerous, but because it was progress. They were coerced into leaving their home with the false promise that they'd come back. They were told their island would be okay, but it wasn't. Instead, their beautiful island was destroyed by a nuclear blast. Today, Bikini Atoll is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, not because it's beautiful, but because it reminds the world of the start of the nuclear age. It's a radioactive reminder of a time when power was put ahead of people. Just a few years earlier, the native people of Bikini Atoll had been told they were making a sacrifice for the good of mankind. And today, that's still the word they use, sacrificed. And honestly, they might be right. But what really happened to them? And what did Castle Bravo really do? Because after that bomb went off, it wasn't just a mistake in science. It was a disaster for the people, one the world has worked very hard to forget. It was supposed to be controlled, careful, safe, at least for Cold War times. The scientists had checked the math again and again. They studied the wind. They said there was no danger. But when the bomb called Shrimp was lowered into the lagoon on that hot, humid morning, something went very wrong. Castle Bravo exploded with a bright flash and a sound that broke the ocean's quiet. It wasn't the 6-megaton blast they expected. It was 15 megatons. In less than a second, it became the biggest nuclear bomb the US had ever exploded, over 1,000 times stronger than the one dropped on Hiroshima. The blast tore a hole 6,500 feet wide into the bottom of the ocean. 10 million tons of crushed coral and radioactive sand were thrown into the air. A huge mushroom cloud rose from the middle, more than 4 miles wide and shooting 130,000 feet into the sky. But the explosion wasn't the only problem. It was what happened next. The high winds, which had already been called unstable, blew the radioactive dust east, straight toward islands where people lived. The fallout cloud dropped radioactive ash over an area as big as New Jersey. On Rongelap, 5 hours after the blast, it started falling, a soft white powder drifting from the sky. The children thought it was snow. They played in it. They even tasted it, but it wasn't snow. It was deadly radioactive dust. Soon the children were throwing up. They developed burns. Their hair fell out in clumps. When the US finally came to evacuate the people of Rongelap and nearby islands, it was already 2 days too late. Many were already sick. Most had taken in enough radiation to die without help. But things got even stranger, because Bikini wasn't the only place hurt by the bomb. More than 80 miles away, a Japanese tuna boat, the Lucky Dragon No. 5, had unknowingly sailed right into the radioactive cloud. The fallout covered the ship for hours. The men got sick, their skin burned. The ship smelled like death, and the tuna they caught, full of radiation. One fisherman died weeks later from radiation sickness. The others stayed sick for the rest of their lives. Japan was outraged. The newspapers called it the ash of death. People stopped buying fish. Protests filled the streets. Hate toward the US grew fast. In Washington, everything started falling apart. News headlines warned of nuclear disaster. At first, US leaders tried to make it seem like no big deal. Lewis Strauss, the head of the Atomic Energy Commission, said the Lucky Dragon was spying for the Soviets. Then, at a press event, he actually bragged that an H-bomb could destroy any city on Earth. As if that was something to be proud of. People around the world were furious. For many Americans, it was the first time they really understood how dangerous and careless their government had been. In India, Prime Minister Nehru spoke out against the tests and demanded they stop immediately. People everywhere wanted answers. They wanted justice. They wanted someone, anyone, to be held responsible. Behind the scenes, a quiet panic was growing. Secret documents started to leak. There were reports of math mistakes, warnings about the weather that had been ignored, memos from inside the government admitting that Bravo was, in their words, an unfortunate accident. But it wasn't just an accident. Something deeper was going on. Something that still doesn't fully make sense, because hidden in all the test results and behind the official press releases was something strange, something no one could explain. People who lived through it started telling a different story, one about secret tests, silence, and being left behind. And the more investigators looked, the more it seemed like someone had known what was going to happen, and did it anyway. The people of Bikini were left with nothing, taken from their home. They were scattered across 4 unfamiliar islands, dry, harsh places that couldn't support life. The soil was poor, food ran out. These weren't new homes, they felt like prisons. Before the bomb was dropped, US officials made a promise. It's just for a little while. But that temporary move became permanent, because the island was poisoned. The soil stayed radioactive for decades. The lagoon never healed. The few who were evacuated carried damage they couldn't see. Radiation sickness was only the start. As time went on, cancer rates soared, thyroid cancer, leukemia. According to the National Cancer Institute, 1 in 3 Marshallese exposed to fallout would get cancer. Women miscarried. Stillbirths became normal. Some babies were born without bones. Soft, fragile bodies the survivors call jellyfish babies. People talked about being tired all the time, too exhausted to work. Some went blind. Families were torn apart generation after generation. And the worst part? It didn't end with the bomb. It was the silence that followed, the broken promises, the years of being ignored. In May 1954, leaders of the Marshall Islands begged the United Nations, "Stop the tests, protect our land, compensate our people." They said the land was the basis of the very life of the people, and it was being poisoned. But Washington didn't listen. Officials claimed the tests were for world peace. They said islanders had no reason to expect permanent after effects. But military leaders knew the winds were changing. They saw it moving toward the islands, and they waited. Rongelap and Ilinginai evacuated 2 days after the blast. Uterik, on the 3rd day. Aluk and Likiep never evacuated at all. U.S. ships sat nearby while islanders were left in harm's way. Some call it neglect, others call it something worse. But the result was the same. People died. And then came Project 4.1. They said it was a medical study. But in truth, it was something darker. Without consent, U.S. doctors turned the Marshallese into test subjects. They collected thyroid tissue. They pulled teeth. They examined women without privacy, all for the sake of science. One chilling report even said that sending radioactive islanders back home would provide good environmental data. Real people turned into research, their pain recorded like lab results. Publicly, U.S. officials claimed the island peoples are well and happy. They said only 3 islands were contaminated, but secret files tell a different story. More than a dozen islands were too dangerous to live on. What else were they hiding? What happens when a world superpower silences its victims and buries the truth? They thought they'd erased it all, that no one would ever find out. But hidden in eyewitness accounts and once classified memos is one last chilling twist. A secret U.S. intelligence mission that went far beyond just testing bombs. Bikini Atoll is one of the most beautiful places on Earth. Crystal blue waters, towering palms, but beneath the surface, it's poisoned. Castle Bravo didn't just scorch the land, it changed the island at a genetic level. Fallout from the blast, cesium-137, strontium-90, plutonium, fell like toxic snow. These weren't just radioactive, they were sticky. They clung to soil, sank into groundwater, and entered everything: coconut trees, taro roots, crabs. Even today, coconut crabs test dangerously radioactive. The air might be safe to breathe, but the land? Still too toxic to feed its people. Once a paradise, now a ghost. A grave. Oddly, the coral reef has begun to come back. Bright fish, branching coral, reef sharks. Nature trying to heal itself. But even that comes with a cost. The fish absorb radiation. It builds up, bioaccumulates, turning the reef into a glowing pantry of poison. Eating from it, still a gamble, and Bikini wasn't the only scar. On nearby Runit Island, the U.S. buried 85,000 cubic meters of radioactive waste. They sealed it under a concrete lid called the Runit Dome. They called it a cleanup, but scientists call it a ticking time bomb. The dome wasn't built to withstand rising sea levels or typhoons. Now it's cracking. Radiation is leaking into the lagoon. Beneath that thin shell lies one of the most dangerous nuclear stockpiles on the planet. And the fallout? It didn't stay in the Pacific. Radioactive traces were found in Japan, India, Australia, even Europe and North America. The term fallout entered the global vocabulary during this era. A new reality set in. A bomb dropped on a remote island could reach your backyard. In 1985, 30 years after Bravo, Rongelap was evacuated again. Cleanup efforts in the 70s failed. The U.S. spent over $45 million, but it wasn't enough. Full decontamination never completed. Today, much of the northern Marshall Islands remain uninhabitable. Bikini Atoll is now a ghost sanctuary. No residents, just scientists, caretakers, and curious tourists. Advocate Jack Niedenthal says, "You can stay as long as you like, but you can't drink the water. You can't eat the fruit. You can't live." In 1986, the U.S. tried to close the chapter. They gave the Marshall Islands independence, along with $150 million for a nuclear claims trust. Sounds generous, until you compare it to the damage. The cancers, the displacement, the ruined lands. Thousands of Marshallese victims still await fair compensation for medical issues and property loss. Marshallese citizens can live, study, and work in the U.S. without a visa, but they are not U.S. citizens or even permanent residents. They cannot vote in U.S. elections. They cannot access many federal programs such as Medicaid, and are subject to deportation. Even after living decades in the U.S., lawsuits followed. The Marshallese took their case to international tribunals, accusing nuclear powers of breaking disarmament treaties. Activists call it the ultimate David versus Goliath. But so far, Goliath still stands. Now that we've followed the fallout and the cover-ups, One question still remains. Why Bravo? Why build a bomb so massive it risked global disaster? Why risk vaporizing islands and turning people into test subjects? Some declassified memos suggest Castle Bravo was more than a test. It was a message, a show of force to intimidate the Soviets. Other whispers hint at secret surveillance technology tested during the blast, meant to track Soviet satellites. Some believe a classified fusion-enhancing material was involved, so secret even US allies weren't told. Behind the scenes were the contractors, private corporations that built the bombs and ran the labs. They made billions, faced no oversight, and every accident brought more funding, more data, more justification for the next test. But the Marshallese haven't forgotten. Peace parks now rise from the ashes. Memorials line the shores. March 1st is Nuclear Victims Remembrance Day. These aren't just monuments, they're warnings. Bikini Atoll isn't just a poisoned island, it's a symbol of science unchained, of truth buried, of beauty turned deadly. And maybe the most chilling truth of all? The bomb wasn't the end of the story, it was only the beginning. Today, Bikini Atoll isn't just known for nuclear tests. Now it's also known for something surprising: scuba diving. Under the ocean, history sits quietly. American warships, aircraft carriers, submarines, and destroyers were sunk on purpose during Operation Crossroads. Now, they make up a strange underwater museum. People from all over the world dive here, searching for pieces of the past. It's a strange twist. These ships were picked to be destroyed by the biggest bombs ever made. But now, they are homes for fish and coral. Bikini's reefs have bounced back. Coral is growing again. Fish are everywhere. Scientists call it nature's comeback after nuclear destruction. But this beauty hides a problem. The sand, the ground, and the food chain still have radiation inside. Groups like Greenpeace still come here. They test the soil. They study the crabs. They support the Marshallese people, who say the island is still toxic. The land looks peaceful, but deep down, it still remembers the fire. The blast is long over, but the effects are still felt, especially in politics. The Bravo test is now a big part of Pacific Island history. Marshallese leaders still bring it up when asking for help with climate change, healthcare, and justice for past harm. Some experts say the US not fully fixing this problem is hurting its power in the Pacific. Meanwhile, China is quietly building stronger ties in the region. And now, when people hear bikini, they don't think of bombs. They think of a swimsuit. The bikini was named after the island. Marketers said it would be as explosive as the bomb. That's part of the Bravo legacy too, turning tragedy into products, forgetting the truth, only remembering the parts people want to remember. But some people do remember. Reporters and investigators are now looking into Castle Bravo as a perfect example of a government hiding the truth. Secret tests, people used like lab rats, radiation cover-ups, and lies hidden behind national security. And the danger isn't over. Rising seas could soon break open the Runit Dome. One strong storm could release 85,000 cubic meters of radioactive waste into the ocean. That would turn a Cold War bunker into a new disaster. Castle Bravo wasn't just a test, it changed everything. A science project turned into a political mess. A tropical island turned into a toxic zone. And the name Bikini? It now hides a dark story in plain sight. The mystery isn't what happened, we already know that. The real mystery is why it happened like this. Why so many secrets? Why was no one held responsible? Why did so many people suffer only to be forgotten? Maybe the most dangerous thing left behind isn't plutonium, it's silence.